Memory is a tricky thing. If you're like me, you may have more problems with it than you like. When someone asks you what you had for breakfast just 4 hours ago, you might be at a loss. Having just learned a new name, you might be chagrined to have forgotten it within 4 seconds. And when you try to recall something you learned the other day, it might be hard to get all the details. While there's no real medications, surgical procedures, or other ways to reliably improve a poor memory, understanding how memory works can give us an insight into ways we can better utilize what we have to work with. Today, we're going to examine how memory is processed and stored according to the multi-store model right here, and use that information to understand how certain methods and mindsets might be used to improve our memory in practical ways. So before we can get into improving your memory, it would probably be helpful to come to a basic understanding of how it works. So according to this multi-store model right here, there are three primary components that go into memory. So the first is encoding. That's the process by which information is transformed and organized by your brain so that it may be stored. It basically turns information that you're receiving, through your senses, into these things called engrams, which aren't really recordings of your memory, but it's more of a reconstruction. But anyway, so then there's storage, which is where these engrams go. And so the first one is this called the sensory store, sensory memory. That's a subconscious store, meaning you don't really need to be paying attention to your surroundings for that store to be actively, encoding. It holds information for only a couple seconds. It's basically like just a bus stop on the way to the longer term memories, short term and long term. Excuse me. So when you actually pay attention to something, that information is then transferred to short term memory, which lasts about 30 seconds, so you can hold about 7, 8, or 9 items on there, depending on how good you are. So the third and final store memory is known as long term memory. And that is an unlimited reservoir of information that is drawn from the short-term memory, basically turning over the information that you have gotten in the last 30 seconds. Just thinking about it, will naturally transfer it into long-term memory. Now, just because it's long-term doesn't mean you will forget it in a short time. This only refers to memories that last longer than 30 seconds. So you might forget it in a couple minutes, but it's still technically in long-term memory. In order to reinforce that long-term memory, you have to exercise the third component of memory, which is called retrieval. And that is the process of recalling memory from the long-term to the short-term storage. And essentially, the more you do that, and sometimes it's natural, subconscious, you don't have to think about doing it. Other times you can do it, and we'll get into that later. But that will basically reinforce the memory. It's almost like making copies of it in some sort of way. And you'll be able to recall it for a longer period of time than you would otherwise. Okay, so now that we have a cursory knowledge of how memory works, we can hopefully use that to understand how some strategies can help us more effectively use ours. So the first strategy is pretty simple. It's just paying attention. If you don't pay attention, information is not going to get transferred from that short-term, or the sensory memory store into your short-term and the long-term stores. Actively paying attention by actually taking note of your surroundings and being sure to be present wherever you are will help you remember events better. Okay, so the next strategy that you can use to improve your memory is called rehearsal. And that is intentionally retrieving information from your long-term storage, bringing it back into your short-term storage for review. So there's two kinds. It's maintenance rehearsal and elaborative rehearsal. Maintenance rehearsal is just simply repeating the information as is in order to encode it better into long-term storage. So if you went out for a walk, you're going to be like, okay, so I'm thinking about my walk. I saw a man on a bicycle, going about 12 miles an hour down the sidewalk, and his shoes were blue and his bicycle was green, Or if you're studying for a test, you might say that try to remember the terms and the definitions of what you're remembering. So like the verbatim definitions, you're not really turning that over in your own mind. You're not adding to it. You're not really coming to an understanding of anything. You're just simply recalling it. Elaborative rehearsal, on the other hand, is retrieving information not only just to mull it over as is, but also to consider its meaning and application to your life and to reality in general. So, in other words, I guess you add something to it, is the difference. Elaborative rehearsal is more effective than maintenance rehearsal. So if I'm, for example, trying to remember a name, I don't remember, I won't just be like, Josh, 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 Josh. I'll be like, Josh, that sounds like squash. Josh's face kind of looks like a squash. Hey, now I remember it better. That's called a mnemonic, by the way. A little fun fact. But it just deepens your understanding of the information so that you can retain it better. So finally, a good tip for trying to remember like factual, semantic information, especially, is to space your learning, space your intake. One problem that I have is I will tend to like binge watch a bunch of videos or documentaries, uh, and then by the time I get done with like watching, a few hours worth, I'll kind of just forgotten most of it. Like I only remember, maybe the first one or the last couple that I watched. Uh, and so it's not really a great use of time, especially if I'm like actually trying to gain that information rather than just, getting entertained. So like this man with the ducks right here, he's got a lot of ducks. That's great. But you can see he's got them like wedged up kind of under his legs, and they're like pouring out of the cage. He's not going to keep his ducks for very long. So it kind of the same logic applies to that learning information. If you really want to, make the best, most efficient use of your time, you're going to want to, learn something, watch something, read something, or whatever, and then actually take time to, rehearse it and then mull it over before moving on to just the next video, and that will allow you to actually, remember what you're trying to learn. It's about time to wrap things up, but I hope you found some useful information about the multi-store model and its practical applications. Just remember to be attentive, rehearse, and space your intake of information. The next time someone asks you about your previous meal, but you can't remember that or their name, just think of how you should have heeded my advice. Good night and Merry Christmas.